In this video, we'll go over VTP and DTP. VTP, VLAN Trunking Protocol. With VTP, you have three modes. You have a server, you have a client, and you have a transparent. So you configure a VLAN on a server. It'll push the VLAN.dat file to the clients. The clients will accept the VLAN.dat file from the server, and it'll overwrite its current VLAN.dat file. Transparent switches, they'll just pass the packets through, but they'll not take action. So it'll take the VTP packet, it'll pass it through to the other VTP client that's downstream of it. But it will not overwrite its VLAN.dat file. So what that means is that you have to configure VLANs on a transparent switch. Now, the good things about VTP is you have a central location to configure VLANs, then it'll push those VLANs out to all the clients. The bad thing about VTP is you have a centralized place to do it, and there's no error checking, there's nothing to stop you from overwriting a good config with a bad config, because everything is just based on revision number. The switch with the highest revision number will push out its VLAN.dat file to all the clients. Now, by default, all switches come as a VTP server. The only thing you have to configure is a domain name, and then it'll join your VTP domain. And if it has a higher revision number, it will overwrite your VLAN.dat file. So in this network, we have our server, a client, a transparent switch, and another client. Then we also have an old switch that we just pulled off the shelf. And let's just say that switch was from another building, another department, another floor of a building, you name it. Then over here we have some equipment for DTP, which we'll cover in a little bit. So here's the server. You can see that we have a revision number of 6. It's a server and CIS domain name. Now there's no password set, but you can set a password in, and it is a best practice to use a password if you're going to use VTP. Client, same thing, revision number 6. Client, CIS, transparent, revision number 0. And you can see that it's transparent and CIS. So it's part of the domain. It'll pass along the VTP traffic, but it will not take part in overwriting VLANs. And then this VTP client, same thing. Version number 6, client, CIS. Now we look at our old switch that we pulled off the shelf. Now this is a switch that was part of our network at one point in time. Then it got replaced, and we just put it on the shelf as sort of like a cold spare for anything. And let's just say for our scenario that we need to add a new switch to add new users. You can see that it's revision number 7, so it's one more than our current server switch. And then it's the server and CIS. So we do a show VLAN over here. We have one VLAN, it's HR, VLAN 2. Come here, show VLAN. We have 3 VLANs. You can see that VLAN 2 is for sales. VLAN 3 is for HR. So wherever this was installed before, the VLANs are different. So whenever we install it here, it's going to overwrite the VLANs. So let's do that. Crossover. Speed things up. And now we should see show VLAN. Oops, show VLAN. All of our VLANs are fine here, but we go to the server and we see that we just overwrote all of our VLANs. Now, that's not a good thing. Our VLAN.dat file just got overwritten by an old config that's no longer up to date. And so now things are bad. Because what if we did not have a VLAN 2? What if we had just VLAN 3 and 4? VLAN 2 would be gone. So that's not a good thing. So that's why VTP is not good, is because it's too easy to overwrite your VLAN configurations. In VTP version 3, there are more safeguards, but it's still not perfect and still too easy to overwrite your VLAN.dat file. Now, transparent, it is best practice to configure every switch to be inside of its own VTP domain and in transparent mode. So what I mean by that is you configure a switch to be in any sort of domain name. So basically I just use whatever the switch name is as its domain name and then make it transparent. So that way no other switch is in the same domain and every switch is transparent. So that way no matter what, it's not going to get any VTP traffic whatsoever. It will not try to send out traffic and it's not going to accept any traffic. But if it does get anything, it's just going to pass it through. But because everything's inside of its own domain, it will not ever form a VTP domain with anybody else. So once again, best practice, have a unique domain name and be in transparent. Now, there are times when you might want to use VTP, and those times are if you are the only person working on a small network, so you have a centralized place and it's just you doing all the configurations, and so you know you're not going to make the mistake. Or if you don't know how to script. Scripting is the best way to do things. Scripting automation is by far the best way to do things. And there's software that you can just go buy to do that for you, or you can also program it yourself. But scripting is much better than VTP because usually with scripting you have backups that can easily install, or you have some sort of verification method to be able to do that. VTP, you're one and done. You configure the server, and whatever's on the server gets pushed out to everybody else. Now, DTP. So DTP stands for Dynamic Trunking Protocol. All these other connections that you see here have been hard-coded to be switchport mode trunk. Here we see we have nothing configured except on port 22, which has switchport mode access. So what that means is that every other port is set for dynamic auto, because by default all DTP ports are set to auto. And auto just means that you are passive. You will do whatever the other side says to do. So if the other side wants to be a trunk, you will be a trunk. If the other side wants to be an access port, you will be an access port. That's what auto does. So plug in a computer. Let's plug it into port 24. And let's plug in a switch. This is a malicious device. So that means it's bad. This is not something that we want to have plugged into our network. Plugged in port 23. Now when you have two devices plugged in that are auto-auto, nothing's going to happen. But let's go ahead and make it a trunk port. So now we just configured it as a trunk port. Give it a few seconds, you'll see that it will come up. So now all the connections are up. Showing trunk. We see that port 23, which is connected to our malicious device, is allowing all VLANs across. So now that device, this switch here, is getting all of your VLANs. Nothing's getting pruned off. So any bad actor, any bad person that plugs into this device cannot access all of your VLANs. So your HR VLAN, your sales VLAN, your IT VLAN, they have full access to all VLANs, which is not a good thing because we do not want somebody to access payroll or HR or IT systems when you have no idea that they're even there. So that's why DTP is not a good thing, because it works great. You plug in your workstation, it comes up. It's going to be an access port. You plug in a switch configured as a trunk, it's going to act like a trunk. That's why DTP is not good. That is why we hard code it as an access port. So if we grab this, we put it on port 22. Port 22 is hard coded as an access port. Now, an access port will only allow one VLAN across. So if a switch gets plugged into some malicious device, they only have access to that one VLAN. Now, obviously, if the switch gets plugged into a port that was configured for an HR VLAN or a payroll VLAN, there's nothing you can do about that. You have protected things as much as possible, but if they get access to the interface that's configured for the VLAN, then they're going to be on that VLAN. But at least they'll only be on that one VLAN and that one VLAN only, versus being able to see everything with the trunk. So to fix that, int FA 24, support mode access, for access VLAN 2. Then if you're going to do a trunk, int FA 023, support mode trunk, and that will hard code it to be a trunk. Now, it does not turn off DTP. This turns off DTP. Switch port, no negotiate. That disables DTP. So switch port, no negotiate, turns off DTP packets. It will not send any DTP packets across. Now, DTP packets, they will negotiate what protocol to use. So if it's Open Standards, or ISL if it's Cisco. So by default, DTP will go with ISL, which is a Cisco protocol. And if the device does not support ISL, let's say the other end device does not support it, it will go with 802.1q. But by turning off switch port no negotiate, it's just going to go with 802.1q and then come up. So while this right here is not needed to hard code a trunk, it is needed if you want to disable DTP. So a quick summary, VTP, it's bad. Be careful when you use it. It can be used safely if the people using it know what they're doing and they don't make mistakes on the VTP server. But I would recommend other methods to push out VLAN configurations, and that is scripting or automation of some sort. And if you're in a small network, you can just log into the switch and configure it yourself. You don't need to have any sort of scripting, but scripting at the minimum. DTP, always make sure that you hard code a switch port to be either a trunk or an access port. Never leave it to be a dynamic port. That way you know exactly what that port's going to be, and you want to make sure that every port that is not connected to a device that must have a trunk, like let's say another switch, is hard coded to be an access port or shut down. So you want to make sure that there's no ports just sitting there that's available that can be plugged into by a bad actor and have them have access to all of your VLANs. That's not good. That's a huge security hole. Switch port no negotiate, that disables DTP. While it's good to turn off DTP if you don't want to use it, it is not a hard requirement because it'll just negotiate which protocol to use, either ISL or .q. But it is a good command to have in your configurations.